The return of the lost star. Brad Damon was not a man easily surprised. Years of service as a Marine in the outer colonies had dulled his sense of wonder, replacing it with hardened instincts and cold pragmatism. But as he stood on the threshold of his underground dwelling, staring at the sleek alien vessel descending from the twilight sky, a strange sense of anticipation stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. The twin suns of New Eden painted the rolling hills in bands of violet and gold. The air smelled crisp, tinged with the faint musk of wild vegetation that grew in untamed abundance around his home. Brad's dwelling was carved into the side of a hill, a humble but efficient retreat. It was his sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of civilization and live quietly, tending his hydroponic gardens and watching the wild beasts roam the valleys below. That peace shattered the moment his wrist computer emitted a sharp chirp, a proximity alert. Brad's fingers reflexively traced the edge of his M780 pulse rifle, hanging just inside the doorway. His brow furrowed. No ships were scheduled to land in this sector. He stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing as the vessel's sleek form emerged from the clouds. Its design was nothing like the bulkier freighters that occasionally ferried supplies to the colony. This was something different, elegant, smooth, and shimmering like quicksilver under the alien sky. Definitely not pirates. Still, Brad's grip tightened around the rifle. Even after years of retirement, the instincts that had kept him alive across countless battlefields refused to fade. The ship touched down gracefully, the engines signing as they powered down. A faint hiss followed as the airlock slid open. Brad steadied his aim, heart pounding louder than he cared to admit. And then he saw her, standing at the edge of the ramp, silhouetted against the ship's glowing interior, was a woman he thought he'd never see again. Her skin shimmered faintly, kissed by the alien sun, light blue with a soft iridescence that made her seem ethereal. Waves of impossibly long, dark blue hair cascaded down her back, swaying gently in the breeze. She wore a form-fitting metallic suit that seemed more ceremonial than practical. But it wasn't her appearance that stole Brad's breath. It was her eyes. Aurora. Brad's voice barely broke above a whisper. The alien woman smiled softly, taking a step forward onto the ground of New Eden, her gaze never leaving his. "Hello, Brad." His grip on the rifle faltered. For a long moment, he couldn't find his voice, couldn't even make sense of what was happening. "You," Brad swallowed hard, lowering the weapon. "How did you find me?" Aurora's expression softened, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through her luminescent eyes. "I never stopped looking." 9 years. It had been 9 years since they last saw each other, since that fateful week on Starbase 12. 9 years since he left her behind, believing their paths would never cross again. Brad stepped forward cautiously, his heart hammering louder than any battle he'd fought. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, casting a glance at the ship behind her. "This colony is off-limits to outsiders." Aurora approached him slowly, her footsteps soundless on the soft grass. She produced a small, glowing document from her belt, an official Confederation warrant marked with intricate alien sigils. "I have permission," she replied, tilting her head. "Special dispensation." The way she said it sent a ripple of unease through him. Brad frowned. "What do you want, Aurora?" For the first time, she hesitated. Her gaze flickered, as if weighing her words carefully. When she finally met his eyes again, there was no mistaking the emotion that trembled in her voice. "You." Brad's chest tightened. He forced a hollow chuckle, more to calm himself than out of humor. "That was a long time ago. We were different people back then." Aurora's eyes narrowed slightly. "Were we?" She stepped closer, her presence now only inches from him. Brad could smell her. A faint, floral scent mixed with something electric, like ozone after a storm. "You're still the same man who saved my life," she continued softly. "The same one who showed me kindness when others saw only an alien girl. And I'm still the woman who fell in love with you." Brad looked away, jaw tightening. This isn't happening. "You could have anyone," he muttered. "You're a high-ranking diplomat now. You don't need to chase ghosts from the past." Aurora's hand brushed his arm lightly, the touch sending a current through him he hadn't felt in years. "I've tried," she whispered, "but no one else is you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken memories. Brad's defenses, carefully built over years of isolation, cracked. He exhaled slowly, finally meeting her gaze. "Come inside," he said gruffly. "At least have some coffee. I doubt they serve anything drinkable in Confederation space." Aurora smiled, not the soft, diplomatic one she wore during negotiations, but something warmer. Something real. "I thought you'd never ask." As they stepped inside, Brad couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something he thought he'd lost forever, or a storm that would unravel the fragile peace he'd built on this quiet world. Echoes of forgotten stars. The soft hum of the ship's engines faded as the heavy door to Brad's home slid shut behind them, sealing out the world beyond. The interior was dimly lit, lined with the earthy warmth of wood and stone, a deliberate design that Brad had insisted on when building his retreat. Aurora moved carefully, her eyes scanning the space with quiet reverence, as if afraid she might shatter the fragile peace by simply breathing too loudly. Brad busied himself in the kitchen, the rhythmic clink of mugs filling the silence. His hands worked with the efficiency of muscle memory, but his thoughts churned restlessly beneath the surface. He had spent years constructing this life of solitude, burying the ghosts of his past beneath layers of routine and survival. Yet here she was, a ghost in the flesh, undoing years of careful forgetting in the span of mere minutes. Aurora's gaze followed him as he worked, her luminous eyes soft but observant. "You always said you wanted peace," she said at last, her voice barely louder than the flickering fire in the hearth. "I never imagined it would look like this." Brad glanced over his shoulder. "It's quiet. That's all I ever needed." "You could have found quiet anywhere, Brad. You didn't have to bury yourself on a planet half the galaxy's forgotten about." Brad smirked faintly, pouring the rich, dark liquid into 2 mugs. "Maybe I'd wanted to be forgotten too." Aurora's expression softened. She accepted the mug he handed her, her fingers brushing his for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. "You never struck me as the type to run away," she said softly. He didn't respond right away. Instead, Brad settled into the worn armchair by the fireplace, watching as Aurora perched gracefully on the edge of the couch opposite him. The flickering light danced across her features, casting shadows that seemed to accentuate the faint lines of sorrow etched into her otherwise youthful face. "I didn't run," he said finally. "I just walked, and never looked back." Aurora stirred her coffee absently, the spoon clinking lightly against the ceramic. "I remember the day you left Starbase 12, she said. "You didn't say goodbye. No messages, no comms, just gone. Like you never existed." Brad exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Would it have made a difference? Her eyes met his with an intensity that almost made him regret the question. To me, it would have. Silence fell between them, thick with words neither dared to speak aloud. The memories were sharp, even after 9 years. The narrow corridors of the starbase, their stolen moments between patrols and diplomatic meetings, the way her laughter had echoed like music in his ears during those fleeting weeks they had shared. He had convinced himself it was nothing more than a brief escape, a collision of 2 souls lost in the chaos of war. But now, staring into the eyes of the woman who had once held his heart, Brad wasn't so sure. "You were supposed to forget me," he said quietly, swirling the dark liquid in his cup. "That was the deal." Aurora set her mug down carefully, leaning forward with elbows on her knees. "I tried." Her voice trembled slightly, as if the weight of those words pressed down on her. "But every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. Every time someone else tried to hold my hand, it felt wrong. I thought, maybe I was broken. Maybe I imagined something between us that was never there." Brad's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her she wasn't wrong, that what they shared had been real. But part of him resisted, fearing what it might unravel if he admitted the truth. "You weren't broken, Aurora," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "But you deserve more than I could give. I thought leaving was the right thing." Her eyes darkened, a flicker of frustration breaking through the sadness. "You thought wrong." The rawness in her voice took him by surprise. He had expected sorrow, maybe even resentment, but not this fire. Aurora rose to her feet, pacing near the hearth like a caged animal. "I spent years chasing shadows, Brad. I accepted missions just to pass through sectors you were rumored to be in. I scored colony records, trade logs. Every lead turned to dust. And then, when I was finally ready to let go, I heard about New Eden." Brad's brow furrowed. "No one outside the colony is supposed to know I'm here." Her lips curved faintly. "I'm not no one to you." He couldn't argue with that. As Aurora stopped beside his chair, Brad's pulse quickened. She knelt gracefully, her long hair spilling over her shoulder as she searched his face with quiet urgency. "I didn't come all this way for closure," she said softly. "I came because I still believe there's something worth saving between us. If I'm wrong, tell me now. I'll leave, and you can have your quiet life. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, Brad, don't let me walk away again." Brad stared at her, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the crackling fire. Could he let her in? He had spent years running from the war, from memories of comrades lost, from a galaxy that had taken more than it ever gave back. But maybe, just maybe, Aurora wasn't something the galaxy had taken. Maybe she was something it had given him. Brad set his cup aside and slowly reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of her hair back behind her ear. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "Not about this." Aurora's breath hitched, and for the first time in 9 years, Brad felt the heavy chains of solitude begin to slip from his shoulders. The galaxy could wait. Tonight, he wasn't alone. "The ghosts between us." The fire crackled softly, filling the small space with the scent of burning cedar. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and curling like silent witnesses to the reunion unfolding within. Brad watched Aurora from his chair, his gaze lingering on the way the flickering light seemed to shimmer against her skin. She was a paradox. A woman who had walked among stars, negotiated peace between warring factions, and yet here she was, in his home on the edge of nowhere. In some ways, she hadn't changed at all. In others, she was entirely different. Aurora sat cross-legged on the floor, absently running her fingers over the worn edges of an old leather-bound book Brad had left on the table. It was one of the few relics he had brought from Earth, a collection of myths and legends from ancient times. "You always loved stories," Brad said, breaking the silence. Aurora glanced up, her eyes catching his for a brief moment before returning to the book. "They remind me that even in the darkest times, there's something worth believing in." Brad leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of her words settle over him. "And what do you believe in now?" She hesitated, flipping a few pages slowly. "I believe in second chances." The words hung between them, fragile but heavy with meaning. Brad exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face. "You make it sound simple, like we can just pick up where we left off. Can't we?" Aurora's voice was soft but insistent. She closed the book and placed it gently on the table, as if handling something sacred. "I know the years have changed us, Brad, but the part of me that held on to you, that hasn't changed. And I don't think it ever will." Brad stared at the fire, letting its warmth seep into his bones. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to let himself reach across the chasm of time and grab hold of whatever this was, whatever it could be. But ghosts had a way of lingering, and Brad had more ghosts than he cared to admit. "Proxima B." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of those words seemed to pull the air from the room. Aurora's eyes darkened. She shifted slightly, drawing her knees to her chest. "I thought we weren't going to talk about that." "We have to." Brad's gaze sharpened, locking onto hers. You know it's the reason I left. The reason I disappeared." Aurora's shoulders tensed. The fire popped, but neither of them moved. "It wasn't your fault," she said after a long pause. Brad's jaw tightened. "Wasn't it? I was the one who gave the order. I pulled the trigger. Those lives, they were mine to protect, and I failed them." Aurora rose slowly, crossing the room until she was standing just in front of him. She knelt, placing her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. Her touch was warm, grounding him in the present. "You didn't fail them," she said firmly. "You saved more lives than anyone else could have in that situation. I know because I was there. I watched you do everything you could." Brad swallowed hard, his eyes searching hers for any trace of doubt. He found none. "But it wasn't enough," he murmured. "It was enough for me," Aurora whispered. "I wouldn't be standing here if you hadn't done what you did." The memories of Proxima B were jagged and sharp, flashes of fire, smoke, and the deafening silence that followed the destruction. Brad had led a team of soldiers into the heart of a conflict that spiraled out of control, and by the end, half his squad had been gone. Aurora had been one of the few survivors, pulled from the wreckage by Brad's own hands. And afterward, he couldn't face her. He thought she would see him as a failure, someone who had let the weight of command crush him. So he left, vanished into the edges of space where no one could find him. Until now. Aurora's fingers tightened slightly around his. "I came looking for you because I needed you to know you weren't alone in that. You carried the weight for too long, Brad. Let me help carry it now." Brad felt the knot in his chest loosen, just slightly. He turned his hand over, letting his fingers intertwine with hers. "I don't know how to let go of it," he admitted. "Then don't," Aurora said, her voice steady. "Carry it with me. We'll figure it out together." For the first time in years, Brad felt something other than guilt gnawing at the edges of his mind. He felt hope. He squeezed her hand gently and offered a faint smile. "I missed you, Aurora." A soft laugh escaped her lips, light and genuine. "I missed you too." They sat in silence for a while longer, the fire burning low. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but it felt just a little lighter with her sitting beside him. Outside, the twin suns of New Eden began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hills. But inside, for the first time in years, Brad Damon felt the faintest glimmer of light returning to his life. Beneath the starlight veil, the stars emerged slowly over New Eden, scattered across the sky like fragments of forgotten dreams. Brad and Aurora sat by the dying fire, their silence a language of its own, filled with the weight of old wounds and unspoken hopes. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, and the distant hum of nocturnal life echoed through the hills. Aurora leaned against the arm of the couch, cradling the empty coffee mug in her hands, tracing its edges absent-mindedly. Her hair cascaded down her back, pooling on the floor like liquid midnight, catching the firelight in strands of indigo and silver. Brad watched her from his chair, unsure how long they had been sitting there. It could have been hours, or mere moments. Time felt different around her, slower but richer, as if the universe itself held its breath in her presence. "I forgot how quiet it gets here," Aurora said at last, her voice breaking the stillness. She glanced toward the small window, where the outline of Brad's ship sat dormant in the distance. "It's not like the core systems. Too much noise. Too many people." Brad smirked faintly, setting his cup down on the table. "That's why I picked it. No one to bother me. No battles to fight." Her eyes flickered to him. "No one to love, either." Brad felt the words land heavier than he expected. He exhaled slowly, leaning back against the worn fabric of his chair. "I thought I was done with all that." "Were you?" Aurora's gaze pierced him, though there was no judgment in it, only curiosity. Brad hesitated, the words caught in his throat. The truth was, he had convinced himself that solitude was easier, less painful. But as he sat there, watching Aurora in the soft glow of the hearth, he began to realize that ease had come at a cost. It felt simpler, he admitted finally. No one to lose. No risks. Aurora set her mug aside and leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. Her eyes shimmered with a quiet intensity. I spent years avoiding risks too, Brad. But I realized something along the way. Brad raised a brow. And what's that? She smiled faintly, though there was sadness laced beneath it. Avoiding pain doesn't stop it from finding you. It just makes you lonelier when it does. Brad's gaze dropped to the floor, the weight of her words settling over him. He had fought wars, crossed galaxies, and stared death in the face, but nothing had ever felt as vulnerable as this moment. Aurora shifted closer, her hand resting lightly on his knee. The touch was gentle, but grounding, as if tethering him to something more than just this quiet room. "You still think about them, don't you?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Every day." "They wouldn't want you to carry that alone." Brad closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories rise and fall like a distant tide. Faces he had long tried to forget drifted through his mind. Comrades, friends, those who hadn't made it out of Proxima B. He had buried them beneath the stars, but their absence lingered like shadows at his heels. When he opened his eyes again, Aurora was still there, her presence unwavering. "I don't know how to let it go," he admitted quietly. "You don't have to," Aurora said, "but you don't have to carry it alone anymore, either." The room fell silent once more, but this time, the silence felt lighter, like the first breath after a long storm. Aurora rose to her feet, stretching her arms above her head as she crossed to the window. The stars outside were brilliant, stretching endlessly across the sky. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, pressing her palm to the glass. "I can see why you stayed." Brad joined her at the window, his reflection appearing beside hers in the glass. For a long moment, they simply stood there, gazing out at the endless horizon. "You don't have to leave," Brad said quietly, his voice barely louder than the wind outside. "Not tonight." Aurora's eyes met his in the reflection, and a soft smile tugged at her lips. "I wasn't planning to." As the fire burned low and the stars stretched on forever above them, Brad realized that maybe, just maybe, New Eden wasn't as lonely as he once thought, and for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't chasing ghosts. Instead, he was standing beside someone who understood them just as well as he did. The weight of what remains. The night deepened over New Eden, its silence wrapping around Brad and Aurora like a veil. Outside the window, the stars shimmered cold and distant, yet within the small warmth of the underground dwelling, they felt closer, almost within reach. Aurora lingered by the window, her gaze distant, as if tracing constellations long forgotten. Brad watched her in silence, leaning against the stone frame of the hearth. The fire had long since faded to glowing embers, but neither of them moved to rekindle it. "How long are you staying?" Brad's voice was calm, but the question hung heavier than he intended. Aurora's fingers brushed against the glass, and for a moment, she didn't answer. When she finally turned to face him, there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't come with a plan." Brad crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "You always have a plan." Aurora smirked, though the flicker of amusement didn't quite reach her eyes. "Not this time." The weight of her words lingered between them, unspoken truths wrapped in fragile silence. Brad stepped closer, the faint creak of the floor the only sound in the room. "So you just crossed half the galaxy on a whim." Aurora's gaze dropped to the floor. "I crossed it because I was tired of pretending I didn't care." Brad's chest tightened. He wanted to reach for her, but old habits held him back. Years of distance, of self-imposed isolation, had built walls he wasn't sure how to dismantle. "I thought you moved on," he said quietly. "I tried." Aurora's voice cracked slightly, and when she looked at him, there was no barrier left between them. Her eyes, usually so guarded, now reflected nothing but raw vulnerability. "But some things don't fade, Brad, no matter how far you run." Brad exhaled slowly, stepping beside her at the window. Their reflections shimmered faintly in the glass, standing side by side, but still separated by the weight of the years between them. "You weren't supposed to wait," Brad murmured, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the glass. "I didn't want you to." Aurora's head tilted slightly, her hair falling over one shoulder. "You never gave me the choice." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The stars stretched endlessly above, cold witnesses to the ache that settled in the space between their words. Brad finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than before. "I didn't think I was worth it." Aurora's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her hand resting lightly against his arm. "You were always worth it." Her touch was warm, grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long began to shift, loosening its grip. "You think we can just start over?" Brad asked, his voice rough with hesitation. Aurora's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I think we can start from where we left off. We don't have to forget what's behind us, Brad. We just have to stop letting it hold us back." Brad met her gaze, and for the first time in years, he saw something other than regret reflected in her eyes. There was hope, fragile, but real. As the fire crackled faintly in the hearth, Brad found himself reaching for her hand. Aurora laced her fingers through his, her grip firm and steady. "Stay," Brad said softly. "For as long as you want." Aurora's smile widened, and she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "I wasn't planning to leave." Outside, the night stretched on, but within the quiet walls of Brad's home, the weight of what remained no longer felt so heavy. And for the first time in years, the stars felt a little closer. Shadows of the past, light of the present. The dawn crept slowly over New Eden, casting long rays of pale light through the narrow window of Brad's home. The soft hum of the wind outside whispered against the glass, and the faint rustle of leaves carried the scent of morning dew. Aurora sat by the edge of the couch, one leg tucked beneath her as she traced invisible patterns along the worn fabric. Her eyes lingered on the distant hills beyond the window, watching as the first hints of gold stretched across the valleys. Brad stood by the kitchen counter, silently brewing another pot of coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, but neither of them spoke. The silence that had once been suffocating now felt comfortable. It wasn't the kind of silence that carried unresolved words or heavy ghosts. It was lighter, as if they had finally crossed the invisible line that had kept them apart for so long. "You're up early," Brad said, glancing at Aurora over his shoulder. "I never slept," she admitted, her gaze distant but calm. Brad frowned. "I thought you were exhausted after yesterday." "I was." She smiled faintly, finally tearing her gaze from the horizon to meet his eyes. "But sometimes sleep feels like a waste when the company is good." Brad smirked as he poured 2 mugs, carrying them to the table. "Flatter me all you want, but I know the real reason. You were afraid I'd disappear before morning." Aurora arched a brow playfully, taking the cup he offered. "Wouldn't be the first time." He sat across from her, cupping his own mug with both hands. "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." Her gaze softened, the flicker of vulnerability returning. "Good," she said simply. The two sat in quiet companionship, letting the warmth of the coffee chase away the lingering chill of the night. But Brad knew the quiet couldn't last forever. "You never told me why you really came back," Brad said after a long pause. His voice was calm, but there was a flicker of curiosity beneath it. "Not just for me, I mean." Aurora set her cup down slowly, tapping her fingers against the rim. She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "There's been unrest," she admitted, glancing toward the window again. "Not just in the outer colonies, but deeper, closer to the core." Brad's eyes narrowed slightly. "I thought the Confederation had things under control." Aurora gave a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "The Confederation is holding things together by a thread. It's not war, not yet, but there's tension. Old factions are resurfacing. Some of them remember Proxima B." Brad's grip on his cup tightened slightly. The mention of Proxima b was enough to stir old shadows he thought had been buried. "And they remember me," he said quietly. Aurora nodded. "Your name still carries weight. More than you realize. There are people who see you as a hero, and some who see you as a threat." Brad leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had left that life behind for a reason. The battles, the politics, the endless dance between peace and chaos. It had drained him in ways he could barely articulate. "I didn't think I'd ever have to go back," he muttered. Aurora's gaze softened as she reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over his. "I didn't come here to drag you back into that life," she said softly. "But if things get worse, I wanted you to know what's out there." Brad studied her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling into the space between them. "It's not just the Confederation, is it?" Brad asked, his voice quieter now. "You're worried about something else." Aurora hesitated, withdrawing her hand slowly. She leaned back against the couch, her arms crossed. "There's been talk of strange movements beyond the outer systems, ships disappearing, entire colonies going dark with no explanation." Brad frowned deeply. "Pirates?" Aurora shook her head. "No, something else. The kind of thing that doesn't leave survivors." The air seemed to grow heavier, and Brad could feel the shift in Aurora's posture, rigid, tense, as if she were bracing herself for a storm that hadn't yet arrived. "I thought New Eden was supposed to be hidden," Brad said quietly. "It is," Aurora replied. "For now." Brad's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning her expression for any sign of deception. But there was none. "You think they'll come here," he said, his voice grim. Aurora hesitated before answering. "I don't know. But if they do, I'd rather face it with you than alone." The weight of her words pressed heavily on Brad's chest. He had built this life to escape the very things Aurora was describing. But deep down, he knew she was right. The galaxy had a way of pulling him back, no matter how far he ran. Brad set his mug down, rising from his seat and crossing to the window. He stared out at the rolling hills, bathed in the soft glow of morning. "If they come," he said, his voice steady, "they'll regret it." Aurora smiled faintly, standing beside him at the window. Her shoulder brushed his, and for the first time in years, Brad felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: purpose. "They always do," Aurora replied softly. As the sun crept higher over New Eden, Brad knew that the peace he had found wasn't something to be hidden from the galaxy. It was something to be protected. And with Aurora by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next.